Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters. Welcome to my weekly live chat. I hope that wherever you're watching this from, the weather is perfect and that you're having a great week. It's a little rainy here in Kansas City, Missouri, so it's fine. It's great. No problems here. I'm super glad that you're here because we're going to be talking about the first week of the Floral Frames Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along, the video series that just launched on Tuesday. Before I get into that though, a couple things, upcoming events. You can always check out quiltingismytherapy.com to see all these, but we have our annual quilt walk coming up June 3rd. It's kind of a big deal around here where you work your way around the historic square the shop is located on, and you pick up parts to the pattern and you can make a free exclusive pattern that we put together for it. Next week, I'll give you a sneak peek and show you what that quilt's going to look like. And then also that night, we're having a dinner and trunk show with me at one of the event spaces on the square, and it's going to be really fun, good food, good prizes. I think the talk should be pretty good too. I like to think that I put on a good show. So if you're interested in any of that, if you find yourself in the Kansas City area, I hope you'll stop by. And again, you can find out all the details to that on quiltingismytherapy.com. If you are watching live, thank you so much. You know that I go live most every Thursday at 3 p.m. Central. Last week was a little crazy, so we didn't do it. Not to get into all the personal stuff, but my baby, well, my middle child is graduating this year. So is Jessica's oldest son, and then we had birthdays, and it's just, I know May is a busy time. And then to launch a video series in the midst of it, Angela, what are you thinking? I'm thinking I need something to focus on to keep me from crying all the time about my baby graduating. So I know that if you are participating in the video series, if life is busy, no worries, they're always going to be on my website and you can do it at your own time. But if you are quilting along with me, this is a great time to ask questions about the designs that we talked through, the video. I've already got a couple of questions that were great, came up during the typing before we went live. But if you're watching this live, go ahead and put your put your question in the chat, because Jessica is here as always monitoring those and kicking out the spammers and writing down some of those questions. So just a great way to make sure that you're successful with everything that we're learning throughout the video series. But it doesn't have to stay specific to this video series. It can be questions about quilting in general. I mean, it could be unrelated questions. We'll see. I can make up answers just as good as anybody, so it'll be fine. Anyway, so if you're not watching this live, no worries. You can leave your questions in the comment section, and I get on there from time to time to answer them. So without any further ado, let's get to the good stuff. So this last Tuesday was a very important day in my life, my mom's birthday, but also the first video in the series came out, the machine quilting border motifs. And so we're just going to kind of hit some highlights. I'm going to show you some examples, maybe give you some tips that didn't make it into the video, and then answer your questions live. So it's going to be a fun way to, hit all the things. A lot of the screenshots and the pictures that I'm sharing in this live chat are from the expanded resource PDF. Now, if you're like, oh, I just need a little bit more help with these designs, I need a little bit more tips and suggestions, you can check that out. But I also have free downloadable PDF with quilting diagrams and tip sheets as well. And you can find all of that. Just click the link in the description box or go to quiltingismytherapy.com. And it's just a great way to have that piece of paper next to you when you're quilting and working your way through the things that we're talking about. So if you check that out, because I think you might find it very helpful. All right, so this video is a little different. So when I put together the idea of talking about quilting the borders of our quilts, I thought, let's talk about technique as well. So this first video might seem a little odd, right? She's talking about motifs in the borders. So one of the tricky things about quilting the borders of our quilts is quilting that design so that it wraps around and that it connects and that it looks right in all the places. And in this video, I was like, you know what? We're just going to throw that away and do a little bit of an easier option where we can quilt motifs, self-contained designs, and put them in certain spots and give us this kind of custom look to our borders without having to connect the designs. So it's kind of an easier option because you can handle those spaces and then move on and fill in between them with a different filler. Now, when I talked in the video, I said, you can put your motifs anywhere you want. So in the expanded resource, I had some examples like, maybe you put motifs in the corners, or maybe the corners and the centers. And those motifs can be square or they can be triangles. This is just representing where you can put those designs, where you can put those areas. And of course, the motif that you quilt is totally up to you. You can do something as elaborate as a feather, something as geometric as a dot-to-dot design like we learned, or really anything in between there. It's just a self-contained design that's going to look custom, give us that nice look like we spent a lot of time on it, but like I said, a little bit easier. So it's a little bit of abstract, a little bit of theory, like this is how we can approach it. And then we saw how we can create some different motifs in those areas. So we started in the border corners. The border corners are such a great place to put those motifs because it just adds a little bit of, I don't know, interest in the corners, draws your eye to the center of the quilt, just looks nice. And you can decide before you start, do I want my motif to fill in a triangle area or a square area? And so it's kind of a fun way to create different effects. I will say, honestly, the size and the shape of the motif that I quilt is dependent on how big that border is. And that's why I love this technique, because it works in borders of all sizes, really wide and really narrow. And so it just kind of depends on what I'm working on. So we saw this geometric dot-to-dot motif, and we've seen this dot-to-dot technique several times throughout the challenges in different ways. But here, I love it because it just gives it a nice geometric look, a little bit of interest, and then you can fill in around it with a different design. So we kind of started off there, and when I'm quilting in the video, sometimes I use rulers, sometimes I don't. You don't have to use a ruler when quilting this design. On a sewing machine, I'm kind of 50-50, but I will tell you on a long arm, I'm definitely going to use a ruler because those diagonal lines can be tricky to freehand. So that's a little bit of how I handle it. Once you quilt your motif, then you can add a little bit more. You can add some echoing, and then in the rest of the border, I'm just going to fill in with a filler design. And here we can see I just did swirls. Whatever design you pick to put in the rest of your borders, make sure it's something that you kind of like quilting or that you feel comfortable quilting because you'll be doing a lot of it. Or if you want some practice too. I love the look of swirls next to the geometric dot to dot, but there is no right or wrong filler to put around it. It's totally up to you. And so again, just kind of by plotting them where you want them, filling in the space in between gives you that custom look without having to connect it. Now this picture right here is just an example of filling in a square shape. So this would tend to be, for me, smaller borders or thinner borders. The square is a little bit easier to fill in. But again, whatever shape you put in there, you can just fill it in with the design of your choice. I'm going with, the geometric dot to dot, of course, but you can fill it in with whatever. I will say, and I said this in the video, I'm all about the symmetry with this. So whatever I do in one corner, I'm going to do in the others. Or if I put one motif on the top, I'll put one motif in the bottom. I really like to keep it symmetrical. Not so much that I'm worried that the wedges are exactly the same size. Not worried about that, but just like the motif placement is symmetrical. You can decide how you feel about that. You might be like, oh, this is great, or I want to make it different and random. That's totally fine too. Then, like I said, once you have your motif, you can fill in the space between that, and you can see in this navy border, again, a little bit more example of those swirls. Now, when I'm filming, I love to use a thread color that contrasts so that you can see what I'm doing, and so I used the gold thread in this area. However, if you are quilting along with me on the panel, and if you purchase the coordinating thread, you can use that dark blue, and it will just give you that pretty texture without the contrast. Now, when it comes to placing your motifs, I did the corners, but I also added some more on the sides, and so you can really pick and choose how many motifs you want to add, how comfortable you are with that, and really how much time you have to quilt the quilt. And a little bit closer here. You can flip them, alternate direction, show one direction and one the other way. It's totally up to you. But in the video, I mentioned that you want to keep your motif design about at least 1/4 inch away from the edge, if not 1/2 inch, just because you don't want to get that cut off when you put on the binding. And this is a perfect example of what that looks like if you don't do what I say. So if you notice the bottom of this motif is kind of cut off with the binding, hey, look, I'm just impressed that it's bound. Just saying. But I didn't quilt that motif enough away from the edge to keep it. I'm not too worried about it, but if that's something that bothers you, make sure you keep that in mind, that outermost border, you may possibly be binding it at some point, so you don't want to get those motifs cut off. And then again, if we step back, we can add some echo lines around the motif to really help separate it from the filler. If you want it to be more of a design element, you really want it to stand out, or you can leave the echo lines out, of course. Throughout all the videos that I do or all the things I talk about, I try to share tips and, you could do this or you could change it. Just know that you need to do whatever you feel looks good. Now, if you're like, I don't even know what I like, Angela, well, then you can just do what I tell you. But you can easily create some different variations, different applications of these techniques. So don't feel like you have to do it exactly the way that I do it. Then, if you're like quilting the motifs and you're super into it, you can build them up and you can add even more to it. And so in the video, we talked about how you can add some echoing and then you could add some filler, like the wishbones are on the bottom, or just on the left a little bit, in between some of those motifs. Again, however I embellish that motif however I quilt it is how I'm going to do it on all the borders. That's my personal preference. So one thing that I have to be careful of is when I start a brand new quilt, I'm super excited, I'm super gung-ho about it, and I might make my first motif really ornate and difficult. But I have to remember I got to do that on the rest of the borders too, especially the last one, the last border when I'm like, I'm over this quilt, I'm so done. So I try to kind of, not go too overboard right out the box. But again, that's just me. Now, when you're looking at placing your motifs, you're defining your area. We saw me do that in the video, just kind of mark that out. You don't have to mark out that section. It's just a good visual for teaching. You can just wing it, totally up to you, or you can use the quilt as a guide. So for instance, if I want to center my motif on each side, most quilts are pieced on a grid, right? I've got 4 blocks, so let me put it right here in between them and have it there. So just know that you don't have to mark out that section. And then you can use different motifs. So in this one, I did a little feather mini motif, just one-sided, not a top and bottom, just the top of it. We just kind of saw the basics of that. But just know that you can replace that. You can put in feathers or different shapes. The technique itself is just placing the motifs. The motif you come up with is totally up to you. Sure, you can even do a little combination, a little dot to dot and feathers, kind of like a little hybrid. Be kind of cool. Of course, even though we saw the dot to dot motif in the feather one, I didn't really get time to show this one. If you think about it, we're just creating a big triangle and adding something interesting in there. So whatever designs that you like for those areas, this is another dot to dot kind of design. I call it the diamond design, but we have this kind of chevron shape and a little bit of a filler. Just a little bit of a different example. It doesn't have to be exactly, the one I showed. The reason I have this picture in here, though, is what I love about quilting is where those lines come together is where it's really going to draw your eye. So that first motif that had all the lines coming to that inner border corner, that's really going to draw your eye to the center of the quilt. Well, if you don't want to do that, or maybe that block isn't pieced really well, this particular design is going to draw our eyes kind of to the outer borders. So again, where those lines go is where the eyes will go as well. So picking the designs can also be based on, well, where do I want people to look? I like to joke, and it's true, I'm not a better quilter than anybody. I'm just really good at hiding my mistakes. Now let's see this on some other actual quilts. And in this instance, it's kind of like my persuasive argument, kind of making you say, oh, you can use it in other areas. Because it's one thing to know how to quilt a design. It's a completely different thing to know where to actually use it. And if you've watched any of my live chats, you've probably heard me say that 5 million times. But when we're looking at the borders of our quilts, sometimes we can use the quilting to pull together multiple borders, especially when they're the same fabric. So in this picture, we have the gray background is kind of like a border, but there's also kind of an irregular shape. So just filling that dot to dot motif. And then in that center piece, you can see I added an echo line inside that first segment. It's really easy to create some different variations with this design, depending on how ornate you want it to be, how big that section is, whether or not you know what you're going to do in the next section, so you're just kind of hanging out right there. A lot of fun variations you can create with that. So especially in multiple borders or in borders that might not be your regular borders. And this is a more simplified version in that teal, that lighter teal strip, a little bit of that dot to dot, just less wedges. Depending again on the size, I'll put more or fewer wedges. It's going to help determine how dense the quilting is. So if you're like, I don't want it to be super dense, I don't want to take forever doing this, you could just add less wedges. Or if you're showing off because you're doing a live chat, you're doing it on video, then you can add more. It just depends on how dense you want the quilting to be. Now this border is pretty thin. I think in this quilt it's like maybe 3 inches, and just shows that you can fit it in those smaller borders too. You're just going to change the size of your wedges accordingly, or the size of your motif. Now in this instance, I found this, so usually to prepare for my filming and all the things, I like to go back and look through old quilts I've done, or see where else have I used this technique. And so this was a quilt I did for Tula Pink, and the border is it incorporates the fabric in the border and in the piecing to create that weird little wedge. And so just using the motif can also help you handle some of those areas that are just little weird, right? Because that border is super skinny on the edges, but it's a little thicker right there in the corners. And you can tell I have it facing the opposite direction. Why? I don't know, just because it sounded like fun at the time. So again, sometimes when you have those borders that are just those irregular shapes or wider in one area and thinner in the other, it's a great way to kind of fill in that space and make it a little bit easier to manage. And I just showed one basic motif because, I only have a few minutes in the video, but you can really create some variations with it. And in this particular example, again, another area where the border kind of bleeds into the background. And so adding that motif within the blocks, it is dot to dot. There's a little bit of what we saw in that video with the wedges, but then just that other shape in the center. So you can really take this technique and you can expand on it, make it as complex and ornate as you want. It really is so versatile, and it's going to grow with you on your quilting journey, which I love. Now, this isn't dot to dot necessarily, but it just shows the idea of a motif as a standalone design, and the filler that you put around it is what's going to help highlight or hide that. That's another thing I didn't really get time to talk about in the chat or in the video. If you put your motifs in there, quilt them first, of course, and then fill around them, because you need to put the main thing and then the filler. If you're like, oh, I don't love the motif, or I don't know, I don't want to be such a main element, or it's just supposed to be subtle, then putting stuff around it that's similar size, same density, is going to help it blend in. But if you really love it and you're like, oh, I want to show it off, then putting something around it that's really dense is going to help it pop. And so here, that motif kind of in the center of the piecing, you can tell those back and forth lines around it really going to dense, really going to make that kind of pop out in the center. So what you put around the motif is just as important as the motif itself. And so just kind of knowing the effect that you're going to get. Do I want to show it off, or do I want to hide it? And then picking the design accordingly, or the size of the design accordingly. And here we can see another example of that border motif. But what I want you to look at in this thinner cream strips, you can see that little tiny border motif. This is like an inch strip, and it's just a little tiny diamond shape. And even in the blue, you can see it's a little bit wider. Those are probably like 1.5 inches or 2 inches. Another little one. So it can be as basic as, a diamond shape, or it can be as ornate as this motif right here. Now, one thing you might say, like, Angela, this motif is not symmetrical. Look how one side is longer than the other. Well, as long as I do that on all of them, it's going to be fine. So the other one would have been the same way, longer on one side, shorter on the other. Even if I didn't mean to do it. So if I quilted my first one like this and I'm like, that's not symmetrical, well, I'm going to do it all the time in all 4 corners, and it will then be symmetrical. So it's kind of like, once is a mistake, twice is a design choice. So again, you have to kind of wrestle with that and find what you like, and if you like the way it looks. But in my mind, as long as it's symmetrical, it's fine. Now, especially if you have quilts with multiple borders. First of all, those are my least favorite kind of quilts to piece. There's nothing more anticlimactic than a long seam for like an inch border. But you can use these motifs to group together multiple borders. And you can see on the right side, there's a lot of little strips. Well, I just quilted a motif that kind of filled in 4 of those strips. So don't be afraid to join those thinner borders together if you want to, create that motif. And then also, doing 2 that mirror image each other kind of helps it come together too. So it just gives it that secondary design a little bit. Again, great for borders of all widths and sizes. The outer border on the left side, I think, is probably 5 or 6 inches wide. Plenty of room to add that motif, and then keeping them smaller in the smaller borders. And just like anything, any creative endeavor, the more you do it, the more comfortable you'll get with those different ideas. Now, this is a huge border. I know this picture is not the greatest. Going through some of my older pictures, I'm like, oh, the phones did not have the same quality of photos back then. But you can see in that wide white border, that motif that's centered, there's that triangle shape, there's that ornate feather motif. There's a lot of other stuff going on in this border too. Just try to ignore that for right now. But that motif is just kind of helping, break that up, make it a little bit more manageable and look kind of nice. In this instance, though, I'm using the piecing as a guide for the placement. I kind of liked how those diagonal lines came, so if I just keep them going in the border, that'd be kind of fun. So when you're placing your motifs, just know there's no wrong way to do it, but sometimes you can use the piecing itself as a guide. Would it fit here? Does it look like it's part of the quilt pattern? There really is no wrong option. Now, once you get comfortable with the idea of quilting these motifs, you can put them anywhere. Now, in this video, we were just specifically talking about borders and how it's a great technique for that. But once you get comfortable with creating those motifs, you're going to find lots of different places you can put them in, especially if you use that little hint of putting filler around it to fill in the rest. So this particular block is from Westward. It was a Midnight Quilter episode. That is a big area. That green piece is pretty wide. I can't remember the exact measurements, but it's big. And so quilting that motif and then using the filler to fill in the rest of the area. So again, you can take that technique and you can put it in other spots as well. So don't feel like, oh, I can only do this design in borders, because that's definitely not the case. And there's a lot of really cool ways you can use it. And I just pulled a couple pictures out from this quilt just because it's a good example of those motifs in the background area there. But again, that's not necessarily what we're talking about. In the video, we were hitting borders specifically. So if you're quilting along with me, and I said in the video, go ahead and quilt the outer border with the motifs of your choice. You can place them however you want. If you're like, I don't really like doing that, then just pick a filler and do it all over. At any point, right, you could do just an all over design in those borders. So there were some questions that came through specifically about this, and then if Jessica has some, she can bring them up to me. First of all, somebody asked, why are we starting from the outside of the quilt? Won't that cause problems when we get to the center? Well, that's a great question. Oh, lots of questions. I love it. The reason we're starting from the outside of our quilt is because that's how it makes sense for me to teach this class. It was the easiest technique, and it works in the biggest border, so that's why I decided it would be the first. If you are quilting along on a sewing machine and you're nervous, right, you're like, I want to start in the center, just know if your quilt is stabilized, you can start wherever you want. So if you've sandwiched your quilt, you put it all together, you can start on the outside and work your way in. Now, I do know that some quilters like to start in the center because it kind of smooths everything out. That's totally fine. If that's the case, or you're quilting on a long arm and you don't want to do it in sections, you can wait till the videos are all done and then quilt it all at once, starting in the center. Totally up to you. It's just how it makes sense for me teaching the class. So that's the very deep answer there. And this isn't a question specifically, but it's funny. Teresa type chatted, it took me 3.5 hours to quilt the motifs in the borders, and it only took Angela 10 minutes. Yeah, that's the magic of editing, obviously. It does take me a lot longer to quilt than what you see in the video. I try to keep them short and kind of punchy and quick. And I think that's just because if I'm watching a video and it's very long and very like drawn out, I can't pay attention. So that's more how I work. But yeah, it does take more than 10 minutes to quilt those borders, depending on how ornate you want to get it. Okay, popular question. Lots of long armers asking this. How would you do the borders first on a long arm? I'm a bit confused. All right, therein is the question, right? So we've talked about this, and I know that some of you that are religious about joining live chats probably already know what I'm going to say. So that is the biggest struggle of hosting these video series, because it is so different in how you approach the quilts. All right, so if you're quilting along with me on a long arm, you have a couple options. You could either work down along the quilt. That's how we're going to kind of go out to in. So you could just do the half and work your way in and then repeat on the bottom as you advance. Or you could go through the whole quilt, stabilize by stitching along all the seams. So then you now have one quilt sandwich, and then you can advance the quilt back and forth. To be honest though, if I were just at home with my long arm participating in this free video series, I would be super grateful that somebody took the time to put it all together. I would definitely print out the free quilting diagrams. And I would wait till the very end to do all the quilting, because I wouldn't want to keep my long arm occupied for 6 weeks. One of these days I might figure out a better option, but right now that's about all I got. Yeah, I toyed with the idea of maybe doing all the videos, releasing them all at once, so long armers can do it, but then I have to be like ready right before it launches. And let's be honest, these videos are getting put together the week before they come out. So I know that's a little troublesome with the long arm, and so it's kind of up to you in your situation. So I would wait till the end, or get some kind of clamp so I can take my sandwich off and on as I'm going, because I don't want to just quilt for a little bit and then get into it. So I'm brand new to quilting. What is dot to dot? That's a good question. I should have specified that. So dot to dot quilting is just a fun name I gave the technique, where we're just using reference points on the quilt or in the block to create these geometric shapes quickly and easily. So in that motif, my dots would have been the inner border corner and the outer edge. And I'm just kind of using that as a guide. And what's great about it is the design fits that area perfectly, especially if it's an irregular shape. And so it's just the idea that we're creating these geometric designs quickly and easily without a lot of marking. If you're like, that sounds interesting, let me tell you it is. And I have a previous Free Motion Challenge video series about it. So you can go to my YouTube channel, go ahead and subscribe while you're there, or go to quiltingismytherapy.com and you can watch those previous videos. All right, what is the best way when getting started on a long arm? How to base the center of the panel. Again, kind of goes in with that first one. If you want to go through and stitch down all the seams, stabilize the whole thing so that it's then one piece, you can kind of move back and forth. I don't, best way to get started, yeah. So starting in the center of the quilt is very tricky on a long arm, and so that's kind of one of those struggles. We'll figure it out eventually. We'll get it there. What is the best marking tool to use if you want to mark guidelines? So that's a good question. It depends on the fabric. I was gonna see if I had my pencil here. I don't. I love chalk pencils, especially if it's darker border. The blue water-soluble pen isn't gonna work because that's on blue fabric. So I was using the Ultimate Marking Pencil. It's great because it's the same pounce powder that's in the pounce pad, but it's solid form, so you can actually draw with it. And so I love that in the darker fabrics, and then it just comes right off. Again, it's whatever marking tool that you have that you feel comfortable with, because I definitely don't want anything to happen to your quilt. So I stick with those two because they've always worked, they've always come out. I've never had an issue. But some people love friction pens, however you say it. Whatever marking tool you have. But I will tell you that dark blue border can make that a little bit of trouble. You'll need a chalk pencil probably. Do I listen or watch the New Heights podcast with the Kelsey brothers from the Quilter in Vancouver? I don't, but you know what? The Kelsey brothers are freaking hilarious. Jeremy, my husband, is a huge Chiefs fan, huge Travis Kelce fan. And so him and his brother have a podcast, and I hear it's hilarious, so I should probably listen to it. Love that. They're so funny, those boys. Okay, if you're not good with symmetry, do you advise more marking? I advise whatever makes you feel comfortable. So when I say symmetry, I just mean if there's 2 wedges on one side, I want 2 wedges on the other. That's it. They don't have to be the same size. Now, I guess that's what we're aiming for, but the symmetry will kind of cover up some of those imperfections. It's interesting. Our brains see perfection in symmetry. They've done like all sorts of studies. Like if a face is symmetrical on both sides, people tend to think they're more trustworthy. But so you could mark more. It's more though for you to kind of see the path and where you need to go. But symmetry is just going to come down as easy as like I need 2 on one side and 2 on the other. One thing you might, I don't know if I said this in the video, when I was quilting some of those motifs, I would start with the center piece and it kind of breaks it into little, and then now I'll put 2 over here and 2 over there. So really, I don't think you have to mark to keep it symmetrical. But if you need to, then do it, whatever you feel comfortable doing. All right, when doing the challenge on a long arm, do I base the entire panel first to enable me to move back and forth? If I were on my long arm and going to quilt along, that's what I would do. I would go through and stabilize all those seams so I can then advance back and forth. When I'm quilting a quilt, though, like a real quilt, Tula Pink's quilts on the frame, I'm not doing that. I'm quilting my way down. So it just depends if I'm going to need to advance back and forth. Now, I know some of you don't have long arms, and you're like, what is she talking about? Just ignore that part, right? But yes, on the long arm, that's how I'd handle it. Do I mark a border from the center out when doing a motif style like the example? You can. Like if you want to start with your center one and then kind of build off of it, definitely. I like to look more to the blocks. I know this is not a great example, this panel, but if I have a big border with lots of blocks, I'll be like, okay, I'm going to put a motif over the 3rd block and the 1st block in the corner. So you can start from the center. That makes more sense. But usually I'm just kind of getting in wherever I happen to find myself on that. So yes, you can, but you don't have to. Which we know that's my answer to everything, right? Like, it depends. You can or you cannot. Again, if you're popping in for live chat and you're like, what is she even talking about? This video series every Tuesday for the next few weeks. I'll be releasing a video tutorial. It's free. We're talking about quilting the borders of our quilts. And next week's tutorial on Tuesday will be chunking your borders. Doesn't that sound interesting? It's not very a technical term, but the idea that we can take our borders and break them up into manageable chunks and then fill them in. Again, it's going to be technique based with some designs, but then after that, we'll talk about how do we turn the corner, right? And then we'll see how we quilt bigger borders. So again, kind of the techniques so that you can take them and apply it with other designs. You don't have to just quilt the design I showed. So it's kind of like teaching a man to fish, right? Teach them a motif and they quilt for a day. Teach them how to do the technique and they quilt for life. So if you're watching along, be sure to check that out on Tuesday. And if you subscribe, you'll get a notification when that comes out. And then like I did this week on Thursday at 3 p.m. Central, I'll kind of recap that section or that video, answer any questions that come up, and we'll just have a good old time. So I hope that all the moms out there have a happy Mother's Day, or the people that have filled a mom-like role for other people. I hope you have a great weekend. I'm going to try not to cry as Peyton graduates. Jessica's oldest son graduates, and then my daughter graduates the next weekend. So it's a busy time. But I hope everybody has a great, great rest of your week. Stay safe, have fun quilting, and I will see you on Tuesday with the video and next Thursday with the next live chat. Until then, everybody, happy quilting.